So I've been very glad to see the presentations. I think my presentation fits in exactly with the other questions that the other presenters have been raising. And I would like to address the next question. Is SMS enough to make organizations safe? This might seem like a strange question coming from somebody who's worked for 15 years in safety management systems. I've been developing them, running them, and afterwards teaching all over the world about them. One of the reasons why it says SRM coach and not consultant is rooted in two experiences I had this year. There were two major organizational accidents. And that made me think about what we're trying to achieve with SMS and if it's really working. The first major organizational accident I'd like to share with you, because I think there's some very relevant points we can recognize. It was in a small manufacturing operation that was making aircraft parts for major aircraft manufacturers. And we were called in because this organization had major quality problems. In fact, their quality certification had been revoked. So obviously there's a big economical threat there for the production. Now, we came in the first week, we looked around, we saw the documentation, but also we saw the people on the floor, we saw the workstations, we saw the management teams in the meetings. And it was clear that the organization as a whole was failing. And it was no wonder that they lost their their quality certification. Our question actually was, how come that this was a surprise? Because these things, they don't just fall out of blue sky. This develops over time. So there were plenty of opportunities to intervene. And all over the past years, they got their quality certification year after year. So they should have been aware that something went wrong. So that was the first week. Second week, I came back to the site and I was told, no, don't go to the factory, go to the hotel. Okay, I came into the hotel and I heard there was a major fire. In fact, the critical production process had burned down. It had burned down the second time in 5 years. So, strange situation where you have an organization that already suffered the same accident 5 years ago, and even stronger still, 3 weeks before the accident, the safety inspection had mentioned that there were certain measures that needed to be taken to guarantee fire safety. So knowledge was not the issue. The organization knew its risk, it knew what it had to do, the risk mitigation was no mystery, but somehow it wasn't capable of converting that data into action. That was the first big wake-up. The second big wake-up was I was involved with the German wings. I was a volunteer that helped, there were many volunteers, close to 1,000, that helped in the aftermath of the accident. And one thing that stuck out for me and made a big impression was I was in the crisis center when they heard that it was a suicide from the pilot, a murder-suicide, if you will. Now, on a human level, that disbelief you see on the faces is understandable. Of course, nobody wants to believe that a professional in our community is capable of doing such an act. But at an organizational level, you have to ask the question, why was this a surprise? It had happened before, many times actually. In 2014, an Ethiopian airliner was hijacked by the first officer. He decided to land in Geneva and ask for political asylum, but he could have just as well crashed on London, Paris, or any of the major European cities. Before that, Linhas Aéreas do Moçambique had a fatal accident, 33 people died, very likely a captain suicide. So how come that when we know that these things can happen, the industry in general and Lufthansa in particular hadn't been mitigating this? There was no risk mitigation strategy before it happened to them. Now afterwards, obviously, there was a lot of knee-jerk reactions, you might call them, of people trying to mitigate this risk of pilot suicide. Now, you might ask the question, were these risk mitigations really effective? Now, all of a sudden, we have the two-person cockpit rule. Okay, so that might avoid that kind of scenario where one guy gets locked out of the cockpit, but there has been a violent attempt by, I believe, on a FedEx aircraft, by a third jump seater who attacked the co-pilots, both the pilots, with the crash axe. That didn't turn out into an accident, but could have been. So what we're trying to do now as a risk mitigation actually can increase the risk, because now all of a sudden we have cabin crew locked in the cockpit. So what about their annual psychiatric evaluation that we're now making mandatory for the pilots? Now, depression is a very strange thing, and it seems that, so as far as I can tell from the internet, there's about 8 to 12% of the population that will suffer at some point in their life of depression. That means that probably in a pilot population who have a very high stress lifestyle, at any given moment, quite some people suffer from depression. Now we have random drug testing to detect antidepressants. So now we're forcing maybe a significant part of our pilot population to give up the very thing that helps them keep these conditions under control. So is that an effective risk mitigation action, I ask you? So these things make me wonder about, is SMS enough to keep our organization safe? I'd like to talk about where we are now. Everybody in this room probably has an SMS and is building to improve it. So there's lots of databases, there's software, there are just culture policies over the head of the receptionist probably, so it can be audited when our clients and our authorities come by. We're counting the reports we're getting, so lots of bureaucratic activity. But we have to ask the question, what are we using for? What is this system that we're building, which is in the end nothing but a tool, is that useful? Now, I think I have to ask a relevant question here. We are in lovely Copacabana. You see lots of people with very beautiful bodies. I want the straight and honest answer here, and maybe we should have had the confidential voting machine here, but how many people here in this room in their life admit to have bought an exercise equipment in their life? Hands up, please. Okay, yeah, the rest of you don't want to admit it. How many of you have used that exercise equipment more than 100 times? Not me. So we got this idea that if we just get the right tool, it will solve all our problems. And this is very much, I've been sitting where you've been sitting many times, listening to people talk about safety management systems, how it's going to solve all our operational safety problems, how we just have to get the safety data and everything will get sorted. Now, that kind of irritated me. When I came back to my company, that wasn't really what I was seeing. We got all the data all right, and we thought we knew what was going on, and then we told our managers, and they said no. Okay, then we tried next time, no. And that could go on for quite some time. So all this stuff about getting safety data and making organizations safer didn't quite seem to be as automatic as they told us. So with this talk, I'd like to talk about the fact that tools are only useful if you use them, and you use them with the right intentions. So the purpose of SMS is basically, the most simple definition you can take is allocate resources to reduce risk. So your SMS needs to change the operation for the better. I found a very good article from Bill Voss from the Flight Safety Foundation, where he was a bit critical about SMS as well, in the same vein as I am critical about it, where he asks, we've made it so complicated and it's such a big bureaucracy, but what is it doing for you? So he gives 4 questions which I think are very relevant and I'd like to discuss today. First question, and I think if you take anything from this talk, take these 4 questions and use them on your organization. That will give you an indication if your SMS is working or not. So, first question, what is the most likely going to cause your next accident or incident? Now, the most likely here has a big load, which we'll talk about later. We are very bad at judging likelihood. Then the second question, which is very important as well, and we've talked about this before in the other presentations, how do you know that this is most likely that it's going to cause your next accident or major incident? Further, and the most important thing that really sums up risk management, what are you doing about that? If you can't express this is our problem and this is what we're doing about it, you're not doing safety management. You have what Sidney Dekker calls a self-referential bureaucratic system, which basically exists for its own purpose. It generates a lot of paperwork about safety, but it is not converting that paperwork and that data into something that is effectively making us safer. And then the third and very important question, is what you are doing working? It's basically about safety assurance. So I think these 4 questions are very important in having a reality check about our safety management systems. We get so caught up in passing the next audit and ticking that checklist, but can we really answer these 4 questions? And more importantly, can everybody in your organization answer these 4 questions the same way you answer them? Because that's what safety management systems are supposed to do. They're supposed to give the whole company the same image and the same picture of your operational risk. So I've been asking these 4 questions, for instance, all over the world in many different organizations, and they're very revealing. When you talk to the CEO and then you talk to the guy pushing the aircraft back, and you talk about these 4 questions, you can get surprisingly different answers. And that's a great indication that something is wrong. So I see 3 common problem areas around safety risk management. First of all, the understanding of risk. And I'll go into detail about how our brain is really working against us regarding understanding risk. And we have to take that into account when we're trying to analyze risk. Because our brain is convincing us we understand what we're talking about, well, we're really not. Then understanding the reality of our operations. We're getting great tools online like LOSA and FDM that help with that, and of course Just Culture is supposed to help people send the right reports. But we have to ask the question, are the reports we're getting really reflecting the next source of our accident? I've seen organizations which were very happy to tell me that they had 100 reports about basically health and safety issues, the equivalent of wearing a high-vis vest. Now explain to me how you can correlate 100 people not wearing a high-visibility vest to the risk of crashing a helicopter into an oil platform. I don't think you can make that correlation, and we have to be very skeptical if we see SMS trying to sell us it as a victory, that we're getting more and more about these high frequency but low impact, long consequence kinds of reports. And then, most importantly, taking effective action. It's good, like I said in my stories, that we know about risk, but if we don't take action, we're not making ourselves any safer. So, to start off with the understanding of risk, there are 3 main areas I think are relevant. First, understanding complicated versus complex, human factors and risk, and our own mental limitations. Some people would call this complex, it's actually complicated. It's actually, this is what we love, isn't it? We're technical people. This is why we got into the business. We love complicated stuff. We love taking apart the alarm clock of our mother and then, yeah, putting it back together without getting all the pieces together sometimes. But complicated means that there are maybe many parts and they interact, but they're linear and they are predictable, they're knowable. This engine, we can perfectly model every aspect of how it operates, which implies that there is one best way of operating that engine. Now, growing up as engineers and pilots and technical people, this is how we view the world, as complicated. But in fact, we deal with aviation organizations which are not complicated, they are complex. And they're not only complex, they are socio-technically complex. What does that mean? Basically, this is an example of a socio-technical complex system. It's the Syrian civil war. Now, nobody here can pretend to understand this entire conflict. And that is the problem with complex systems. They're so big that not one person can know everything about it. You can know a bit about it, so you can know the situation in Syria versus the rest, maybe, but you cannot possibly know all the interactions between all these areas. So what are the properties of a complex socio-technical system? There's a constant dynamic interaction between all the actors. So that means between systems, between technology, between people and other systems. So the other thing is that it's unknowable. And this is something our brain has very difficult time understanding. We think we understand. We think what we see is what there is. We'll talk about that later. It's also non-linear. That means that in a complex system, a very small input can give a huge output. This conflict supposedly starts, which is obviously some sense-making, but with one guy in Tunisia lighting himself on fire, which started the Arab Spring, which then started the revolution against the dictator. So very small or relatively small inputs can give a large output, which is different than our assumptions about complicated things, because here we assume that if things went bad very big in a big way, like this engine exploding, something big must have happened, like a bird going in there to make a fan blade separate. So that's how we think the world works. Well, in fact, the interaction between various components can make it so that no component should, you can have a failure without any broken component, which is also very difficult to compute because our brain likes simple explanations for difficult problems. So our tendency then, as technical people, is to go down and inward. We like to go down to the component level and see, like with an engine, what went wrong. So the correlation of that is, of course, that once we find a component, we just need to change that component out, and then we fixed our system. Brilliant. The problem with complex socio-technical systems is the component failure was probably a result of the relationships between various other components. So if you just fix yourself the end component which ultimately gave up, you have not done you didn't fix anything regarding the relationships, which can make another component in your system fail. So this is one of the reasons why we need to ask why does stuff happen and not just what happened or who did something wrong. Because ultimately it's not a useful question. Even if we figure the what or who out, if we don't understand the why, we're not able to put in interventions that will prevent the next complex failure in our organization. So that's another slide. Between the 4 questions and this, I think you're well on your way to understand risk. Why are there goldfish here? I think this is what represents perfectly what safety professionals should be. this little goldfish jumping from one into the other. What is local rationality? Basically, local rationality is a psychological concept that says people do what makes sense to them given their understanding, their goals, and their focus. Now, everybody has different understanding of their situation, has different goals of the situation, and has a different focus. Basically, it's like asking a goldfish, what is a goldfish bowl? The goldfish doesn't know, it's in there. It's only once you start comparing goldfish bowls to each other that you can really see what their point of view of the world is. And this is very important for safety people to recognize that while after an accident, it's pretty clear what happened. We can make this neat chain of events and make sense of it in our brain how it happened. Before the accident, everybody is in their own goldfish bowl with their own limited local understanding of the world. Until we understand what their goals, understanding and focus at the time of the accident was, we can't make sense of it on a systems level. So, hope it works. This is a hypnosis experiment. Can you click on? Okay, here we go. No, experiment failed. Here we go. Please look at the center. Please look at the center. It doesn't. Can you click on it, please? Technology. Yeah, this is a pity. We'll try this later. We changed the folder and PowerPoint doesn't like that. So the objective of that was exactly what Rod was saying. Here we go. The work. It's pretty neat because it's a nice illusion. Here we go. Look at the center dot and keep looking at that, please. There's a test afterwards. Keep looking at the center. This is where I get to perform some hypnosis on you. Okay, so it's run quite a course. Okay, who saw those dots disappear on the periphery? Probably depends on your viewpoint. Well, this is a perfect metaphor for our focus. It's what Rod was talking about this morning, the human eye and the brain, because our perception of reality really is not only just what our eyes see, but how our brain interprets those signals. And in such an exercise, you can see if you're focusing on one dot, you start to lose awareness of the other dots. They never went away, but your eyes don't see them anymore. And that's a perfect metaphor also for our brain. Once we're focused on one thing, we start losing sight of others. So the trick of risk management and understanding risk is that we have to pull back a bit. We can't focus too close to the problem because we start losing sight of everything around that. So this is why a good safety investigation needs to look beyond this chain of events. This is Reason's Swiss cheese model, which is useful to understand that an accident isn't due to a single component in our system. But the danger of this kind of representation of accidents is that there's only one potential pathway. So if we start to assume that if we understand through our accident investigation what the various steps were, our assumption is, okay, now we just have to plug the holes backwards and we mitigated our risk. But risk management is not the reverse of accident investigation. It looks more like this. You have various pathways that can lead to an accident. So you have to make sure that you look at and you pull back. You look not at the one pathway, but you look at the several pathways. Because if you are focused on just solving one problem, and you could argue this was the case with Germanwings was actually an accident that was, well, an accident is debatable, but it's a failure in our system that was enabled through 9/11, through another risk mitigation, which was a closed cockpit door, which enabled this to happen. So we have to be very careful when we're trying to mitigate risk. If we're just locally applying risk mitigations to do this kind of narrative, all these mitigations, they add complexity to our systems. And not only is complexity confusing, it's expensive. So every risk mitigation that we apply to our system costs resources. It costs time, it costs money, and it costs mental effort of our people. So when we're talking about wrong deck landings, it's very well to talk about technology, which might solve the wrong deck landing issue, but what is the cost of that? What's the attention cost of that? We're making an already complex cockpit more complex. So we have to really look at the system view, not just at the very end of the chain. So those are the consequences of complexity. Our knowledge and understanding of the system is limited and it's local. So the defense against that, as a safety professional, is talk to a lot of people. If we only talk to the people closest to the accident, we do not have a systematic understanding of what happened. We have also, maybe controversial statement, but behavior of people and human error is a consequence of the complexity of the system, and it's not the cause of the complexity. Now, maybe this is true, maybe it's not true, but it helps you to think about complexity different. If we think about just culture in terms of moralistic judgment, that guy made an error, he was the guilty one, we're not really helping ourselves, because what can we change in the system after firing that guy that is going to prevent the next guy from doing the very same thing? So we have to look at behavior as a consequence of the complexity of the system and not as a cause. And we have to realize that small actions can have big consequences. And small actions, we'll talk about that later, about violations and practical drift. But this is another thing that our brain doesn't really get. It's like with the engine that's complicated, it's very solid. So for the engine to go wrong, something big must happen, like a bird strike. Well, in a complex system, that's not necessarily the case. So there are also mental limitations which are very well understood in science. And a very good book is Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman. He's a psychologist who won Nobel Prize for economics, actually, because his major field is decision-making under uncertainty. Does that sound familiar for risk management? So his findings, and he's done lots and lots of experiments, says basically that there's two ways our brain thinks. There's the system one, which is intuitive, quick, and makes quick judgments. It's obviously there for our survival instinct, so we can act quickly. But in the modern world, that system one is actually tricking us quite a lot. The system two is more deliberate and is more rational. It's not entirely rational. We think it is, but it's not. And the tricky part is that the things that system one assumes, system two doesn't necessarily recognize as shortcuts. So to give you one example, there's the famous Linda experiment. I'll try to repeat it here. So if I tell you about Linda, she's a young woman, she went to university, she wears glasses, she's politically active, and she goes to rallies a lot. Now, I ask you the question, is it more likely that Linda is a bank teller or that she is a feminist and a bank teller? Hands up who thinks she's a feminist and a bank teller. Nobody, you've heard this one. Statistically, in experiments, the brain assumes, because of the description, that she is a feminist. But we said feminist and bank teller. So statistically, actually, she's a lot more likely to be a bank teller than a feminist bank teller. So this is one of the shortcuts we do also in operations. Our brain assumes, on the basis of what we do, we model our operations on the basis of what we've experienced before. So here maybe we find an explanation for Germanwings. Never before had a pilot committed suicide. So in our brains, we didn't really necessarily think it was a possibility. While in fact, statistically, it was a proven fact that it was a possibility. So heuristics are basically shortcuts in the day-to-day life. Our brain is constantly looking to make sense of the world, and it looks for patterns in the world, even when there's no patterns to be found. A famous example is the stock market, and people who think they can predict the stock market. Well, in fact, is mostly random. But our brain thinks it can detect patterns where there are none. So another consequence is that we have a lot of mental biases. Now, one of the biggest bias is the hindsight bias, which is a huge obstacle for good accident investigation. The hindsight bias is something that basically after an accident happened, and with all the, some people in America they call it Monday morning quarterbacking, is basically thinking about the situations with all the data at hand. And then projecting yourself in that situation and thinking, oh, they should have done this, they should have done that. Well, in fact, during that situation, we're talking about local rationality, the people in the accident scenario did not have all that information available. They were making decisions under uncertainty. So our brain tells us that that doesn't matter. And this is the tricky bit about biases. Even if you know you have it, you're still convinced that you understand it. So there's lots to be understood about this, and we can talk about this for hours, but I've put up a lot of resources on my website. I'll show the address there. It's lots of good links to lose yourself for hours to talk about this. So we have to deal with that socio-technical complexity. A good start is to create non-technical skills in our safety professionals. Basically, the agility and adaptability to complex situations. So the assumption there as well is, and I see this a lot with risk assessments, that risk is static. Well, risk can't be static because our organizations are dynamic and complex. They're consistently changing. So we can't have static risk assessments. What does that mean? Well, many times you see a risk assessment or a safety case being made, and then it's approved and goes in a drawer for 5 years and never to be touched again. But in the meantime, our environment, our operational context is constantly changing. We have new people on board, we have new managers, we have new technology, and the original safety case might not be valid. So we have to be very careful when we make safety risk assessments that they are up to date. So we need to understand also the psychology of risk. When we're asking our professionals how likely something is, very possibly they're telling us things that are of no value at all. When you ask an expert, is it likely or not, will largely depend if that expert has actually encountered that situation in his own past. So understand how heuristics play a role in the risk assessment phase. But ultimately it comes down to critical thinking, asking really good questions. And this is deceptively simple. It's difficult to ask good questions, because to ask good questions you have to take other perspectives. And to do that you sometimes need to physically go elsewhere. The worst safety professional will be the one who's stuck in his cubicle looking at manuals, because he will not understand the complexity of day-to-day operations and he will not ask the right questions. So your safety professionals should, as much as possible, be in contact with a very wide diversity of people to understand their local rationality. And the biggest thing that they can bring to your organization is to start building a system picture of your organization. And that's the S in SMS that's often forgotten. It's safety management system, a systematic way to manage risk. And that systematic way requires a system view of your operation. So, moving on, is this your SMS? If your SMS is telling you there's no problem and we're in great shape, while in fact you're not, you might be in trouble. Because not only is this useless, it's worse than useless. It creates a false sense of security. If your SMS says, yeah, we have all our risks under control and we get reports, so we know that our people are telling us, we would know if something went wrong. Those are famous last words of Piper Alpha, for instance, where the manager of the platform said, yeah, I was comfortable that everything was okay because nobody told me otherwise. So your SMS needs to reflect the reality of your operations. There are three basic concepts that are very important there: is work as imagined versus work as done, just culture, and successful investigations. So first about that work as imagined and work as done. Work as imagined is what basically our manual says the operation should be doing. Now, continuously, your procedure that says to go from A to B is under pressure. Now, under pressure by the day-to-day challenges of your operation. There's always not enough time, there's manpower issues, there might be spare parts issues, there might be bad weather. So all of these things interact and put pressure on that work as imagined. So how many people that are pilots have done exactly the same flight twice? Nobody, of course, because our operation is dynamically changing. Everything is different, so there's no way that the procedure can cover every eventuality. And also, worse even, different procedures can conflict each other. So where people say, I'm sure George will talk about this later, when we talk about violations, people think about violations as a bad thing, but sometimes violations are the only way to get the job done. We're quite hypocritical about that as an industry. One example is the work to rules strike. For instance, in Europe, when usually the French, when they don't like the work, they call a work to rules strike. So they're not really striking, but they're following every rule in the book and everything goes slower. What does that tell you about that system? Aren't they supposed to always follow every rule in the book? So how come that once they are doing that, everything goes slower? Well, that's the work as done. In reality, nobody can follow all the rules because our rules look like this. Have you done in your organization an exercise like this? Put together every manual, every rule, every personnel manual, operations manual, instruction that's ever sent that people are supposed to follow and put that on a pile? What was the result? Now, we're very much increasing the complexity of our system to a point where we have to ask ourselves, is our organization still knowable for the people working in it? And I think this is a big role for our safety management systems. We have to start looking at reducing this pile, because in it lies complexity. All these manuals, they say different things, subtly different things. And they got in there for very stupid reasons sometimes. So we have to be critical towards all our procedures as well, because they might actually be not only hindering the operation, they might actively creating complexity and confusion. So, like we said, adding defenses, and what usually people take as a defense against risk, is creating a new rule. So, in this situation, if you know about something like suicidal pilots and you create a new rule that comes on top of all these other rules, do you think it's going to be effective? How do you know that it's going to be effective? Have you started to look at the operation and see how many people are following all these rules? So you have to understand that extra defenses are not always the answer if they're only looking at single scenario events. Okay, here we go. This is a test. There will be a scoring afterwards. It's about looking at who's a good investigator.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
But how did you know?
Madam, as any horticulturist will tell you, one does not plant petunias until May is out. Take her away.
Sorry, madam.
It's just a matter of observation. The real question is, how observant were you?
Anybody see something in this video? How many changes did you see? You were all thinking I was going to ask you who done it. But that wasn't the question. The question was, how many changes happened in this video? Anybody more than 5? Changes? Nobody saw any changes? Interesting. And thought you were all very good observant investigators. Nobody more than 5. Okay, can stop already. 21 changes.
And action.
Clearly, somebody in this room murdered Lord Smythe, who, at precisely 3:34 this afternoon, was brutally bludgeoned to death with a blunt instrument. I want each of you to tell me your whereabouts at precisely the time that this dastardly deed took place.
I was polishing the brass in the master bedroom.
I was buttering his lordship's scones below stairs, sir.
Why, I was planting my petunias in the potting shed.
Constable, arrest Lady Smythe.
This was an advertisement for road safety in London, I believe. Some people might know it. It's a great example of how we think that what we're looking at is what's really happening. But that depends largely on the kind of quality questions we ask. If we ask only one question, who done it? We're so focused on that we're not looking at the complexity of our operation. So, and think this ties in with just culture, where just culture is not just only to protect obviously the value of our safety reports, so people feel comfortable reporting. We also have to understand that just culture is really essential to make sure that we don't go into knee-jerk reactions that our brain is tricking us into, and that are really not effective to change and improve our operation. So, few questions about your just culture and your operations. Have you explained why you need a just culture to every level of the organization? Because obviously people hear about just culture, but if they don't understand why this is so necessary, you will get situations where at the supervisor level, yes, they heard about a memo about just culture, but the next time that somebody screws up, he's going to be rather irate, as supervisors can get, and it can, even just a good bollocking can actually be perceived as a punishment. So if not every level in your organization is totally on board with the philosophy of just culture, it's not going to happen. So the other thing you have to realize is that your people understand how just culture works. It's not only a fact that you have a policy written against the wall, you also have to have competent investigators who understand human factors, so who are trained to look beyond the whodunit question and who can look at all the things that are different in the operation, so they understand the performance influencing factors George is no doubt going to talk about. So the other question is everybody applying it consistently, because it's nice to have a just culture in flight operations, but if the engineers and mechanics aren't getting the same treatment, you still don't have a just culture in your organization. So another big question is, who reviews the events? Who gets to judge what is acceptable and not acceptable? Are you asking what is acceptable to people who know the operation, who know the messy details of the day-to-day job, that they themselves were in that kind of a situation? They can judge if what the guy did was in fact necessary or not. Because if we don't, we are trying to hold our people up to a standard that's imaginary, that's the work as imagined, that's in all our manuals. But in fact, if you ask 10 people, could you have done the same thing? Could you have gotten the job done following that procedure? And 9 people say, no, I don't have the time. One example is on an Airbus 320 turnaround, we're asking the mechanic in 30 minutes to do 60 separate maintenance tasks. Now, under normal conditions, that's feasible. But if one thing goes wrong, what happens to all the other 29 tasks? So we have to be realistic about the pressures that our people are under day to day in our operation. So the who reviewed these events, please make sure that in the review phase of accident investigations or incident investigations, you involve the people that are actually operating, so they can have a reasonable judgment of what is going on. Then, successful investigations. You have to start with the end in mind. What's the purpose of a safety investigation? It's so that you have an effective recommendation that will make your operation safer. If your safety investigation is not making this, it's basically useless. If the conclusion of your safety investigation is, yes, it was human error, move on, well, you've wasted everybody's time and money, because you cannot learn from that and you cannot change your operations successfully from that. So successful safety investigations require that you have competent investigators who know about these biases, who know about human factors, and who are trained to look at the system and not just at the individual situation. So here we come again to the new non-technical skills for safety professionals that we can bring in. And I think the main one we've been talking about this morning as well is collaboration. Why is collaboration so important for safety professionals? It's because of complexity. Our systems are so complex, one person cannot possibly know. It would be sheer arrogance to think that we understand the whole system. Every part of the organization and every part of the other organizations have their own local rationality. We have to put the goldfish bowls together to get a system-wide view of what happened and what is going to influence our safety performance. So collaboration, and this is a great example of that. I hope that during the network you exchange business cards and on a regular basis keep in touch and share your operational experience, because that's really what will make you more efficient. Critical thinking, again. Critical thinking not only about the system and asking good questions, but also about our investigations. Our investigations really getting to the root causes and the contributing factors that cause the accident, or are we trying to, are we allowing our brain to find a plausible explanation? Accessing and analyzing information, obviously a key skill, but how many people are accessing, for instance, information outside the company? There's a wealth of information available. I'm glad to see the initiative of Heli Offshore, because that is a great opportunity to bundle that common operational knowledge and can help to analyze the information. But the problem we can face here is information overload. So it's a skill as well to analyze information. Just information and data, very much like FDM, on its own is not enough. If we cannot convert that to what they call actionable intelligence, something that you can go to your manager with and have a reasonable confidence that the recommendation you do will have a positive effect on your organization. There you go. And finally, curiosity and imagination. Might seem like a strange skill for a safety professional who's a technician, but basically, if your system is complex and dynamic, there's many different scenarios that can happen. We have to be curious and look at not just what is plausible, but what is possible. And that means that we have to stretch our comfort zone sometimes, and we have to ask things about stuff we don't know. Because again, in a complex area, we cannot possibly know everything. So curiosity and asking questions is really the best defense against bias and heuristics. So, like we said before, communication, communication, communication. Now, communication is first and most about listening. And this is a skill. I went through my coaching training. Active listening is taken for granted, but is so difficult to do. You really have to train yourself to actively listen to what your people are telling you. Because again, your brain starts to take shortcuts. If you do not attentively listen during interviews, you are missing a lot of these fixtures, like in the video. We're having all these kinds of clues that people tell us in interviews which go unnoticed because we're in such a hurry to confirm our biases that we forget to actively listen. What are these people really telling us? Are they really telling us that, yeah, this was no surprise for them because they've been reporting it so many times and nothing happened? Well, what does that say about our system? So all these things happen by listening and observing. And observing, I've been hearing that there's great initiatives going on for LOSA. LOSA can be a fantastic tool to look at what's really happening in our operation. Provided, of course, we don't go after individuals, but we start to look at it from a systems perspective. Why are these people doing what they're doing? Why are they not following? And I guarantee when we're doing LOSA, you will see people not following procedures. But that might be actually defenses, that personal defenses that they are doing to not get in trouble. So we can learn from that because in the end, our people, most of the time, they do a great job making a very complex system work. Not always following the rules, but they make it work. So we have to ask ourselves the question, what makes our system successful? Looking for factors that will promote a robust and resilient organization instead of just looking at the factors that will make it fail. Because if we're only looking at what we can fail, we can only see what we need to avoid. But if we can look at what factors are contributing to success, then we have a target. So if we do more of that, we can assume that we're making a more robust and resilient organization. So this observing is not just for failure. We have to observe for success as well. It's critical that we understand what is needed to set up our people to succeed, not just not let them fail, which is quite different. And feedback. Like we said this morning, feedback is the most underrated tool that you as a safety professional have. Now, feedback is really the way that you can steer the organization towards more desirable behavior, to get more background information and get more visibility of complex issues. If you're just collecting reports and sending back a standard reply, thank you for your report, that is not feedback. Because the person that received that, thank you for your report, is basically assuming it went into a garbage bin. Feedback means that you tell these people what happened with their report. Even if you could not solve what was reported, they need to know why it was not possible and why it's still useful to report these kinds of things. And that feedback is quite a complex issue. And that's a skill that we can learn. It can be learned perfectly, but we have to be really aware of how a lack of feedback can kill a reporting system dead just as much as a bad just culture can. So, taking effective action then. And this is where I come to my story of converting myself into a coach. I've been certifying myself as a professional coach, which taught me a lot about these psychological tools, which I believe can be very, very useful for safety professionals as well. What does a coach do? A coach, contrary to a consultant, does not tell you what to do. A coach helps you to clarify your situation and your personal goals and the system's goals, and tries to detect, okay, what are your options to do? So you notice the difference here, that the coach doesn't assume that he knows what is necessary to do. And I think this is great for safety professionals as well as an attitude, that you go with an open mind to the people in your organization and you listen to them and clarify what their problem is, what their goals are, and what the options are to get there. The second part of coaching is responsibility. Before people take action, they need to have a sense of responsibility. So as safety professionals, we can clarify that responsibility as well with our managers, with our supervisors, and even individual in our organization. And then the third part is action, an action plan. It's not enough just to say you will take an action. You have to be very specific about what action you're going to take, how you're going to take it, when you're going to take it, and what will be the measure of success. How many organizations are measuring their actions that way? If you don't measure how actions are implemented, you can't measure if they're successful or not. And that's the how do you know it works? Because you might assume that somebody, because a manager told you, yes, we will do that, and it's done. If you don't have specifics, there's many ways of doing something. That might be just to tick the box. He sent an email to somebody else and he assumes it's done. Or they went really through emotions and had a 2-hour instruction to tell everybody how it should be done. That's a very wide range of doing, of taking action. Those 3 steps, I think, can help safety professionals approach their relationship with their management in a much more constructive way, where traditionally safety management people sometimes are perceived as people that bring bad news to the organization. In this way, we can be a more collaborative partner to our management team. So the SMS itself will get used more as a tool because now it's useful. The biggest obstacle you can come across is this phase during management meetings. I've caused this kind of phase. It happens when we start bombarding our management team with useless information and useless data and bar charts which actually are not actionable. So we have to make sure that we address what's in it for me, for the manager. What's in it for them? When we're telling safety data, how is that relevant for them? If we make it more relevant, automatically you will get more management commitment. And this is what I have to say really irritates me in ICAO is they say get management commitment as if it's so easy to go into a shop and get a bag of it. Management commitment takes a long time to conquer and takes even more effort to maintain. Because if the management doesn't see results from the SMS in their own area, they will lose commitment. And they are right to ask critical questions. We're spending so much money on our SMS. What is it doing for us? And if you can't ask that question, sooner or later you're going to lose the support you need to get things done. So avoid this phase in meetings, please, and make sure that your safety meetings are relevant to your management team and the staff members attending. Another thing that's relevant with coaching is you have to understand motivation. With Just Culture, we talk a lot about the stick, about how punishment is not great for motivating people. That's true. But science has also conclusively proven that carrots, incentives to do something, are just as bad as sticks. What carrots do is like the green dot. They focus attention, which is great if your people are doing a mechanistic task like producing 100 widgets. If you give them a reward for making 120 widgets, that's no problem. But it's proven psychologically that if you make people do stuff for a reward, that cognitively, for tasks that require a minimal cognitive load, putting incentives there is really negative and can reduce performance. So what's the alternative? The alternative to this, which is extrinsic motivation, external motivation, is intrinsic motivation. I've put up a great video from Daniel Pink on my resource page, which goes deep into that. But basically, intrinsic motivation is what any professional has when they're doing their job with, well, enthusiasm, let's say. It usually requires 3 parts. That person has autonomy, can self-direct, has a mastery, that they know how to do the task, and that they know why they need to do the task, the purpose. This is called self-determination theory. And I've written a blog article, which is on the page, which explains why, if we are communicating about safety, we have to address these things. If we take away autonomy from our people, automatically we'll reduce motivation. If we don't explain people why we want them to do a certain action or change a certain behavior, we're not getting the motivation. So we need to be very clear in our communication based on what science tells us about motivation. Now, lots of things are said and done about goals and objectives, and the problem with this stick and carrot here is that this philosophy for setting goals and objectives can have very perverse effects. You see it in oil and gas, for instance, with lost work time incidents or something like that, correct me if I'm wrong, where the division or the platform gets bonuses based on their performance related to accidents that require personal injuries that required people to go away from work. Now, what's the perverse effect of that is because they get a bonus, nobody wants to tally up an accident or an injury because it will affect their bonus. So they will send people to the hospital with broken legs with a laptop so they don't have to count that injury as a lost time incident. So is that really the purpose? So here we need to be very careful with setting goals and objectives that are generating what Sidney Dekker calls the metrics against dependent variables. Safety and things like zero accidents are dependent variables. You cannot control them directly, so it's a lot easier to fake the numbers to make the thing fit rather than change something where you don't have control over. So you have to be very careful when we are giving incentives. I've seen situations where people were getting small rewards for making safety reports, and obviously the organization got safety reports, they were happy, the auditors were happy, but the safety reports quality was really in the nature of, yes, Mr. X didn't wear his high visibility vest. So really of no value to our safety management system to predict accidents. So the alternative here is for your organizations to really define a compelling vision. And that vision should be positive, not a negative. And I know in this industry there's a lot of organizations that have a target zero goal. But if you think about it, a target zero goal is zero accidents is like an anti-goal. It's something, well, you don't have any control over. If you have zero accidents, well, okay, I'll take it. But if you have an accident, you fell, but you didn't do anything different. So that kind of goal does not incite action. I would advocate strongly to make a more positive goal and look at what we were talking about before, the safety 2 approach of what are the things that make our organizations successful. So we count things that give us a better chance of making a more robust and more resilient organization, and we don't have to count negatives like accidents and incidents. So the skills to generate action, think about coaching instead of advising, because if you think about it, if you give advice, you assume that you know the problem, but allow people to come up with their own solutions. Ask professionals that do the work to come back and give you solutions that you can facilitate to management. Understand the motivation and effective communication and influence, which is really a skill that can be learned, and it's not to manipulate, but you have to think about all the hard work you do to collect all these safety data. If you then present that to your management team and you're not able to convince them and you put them to sleep, well, you've lost months and months of effort. So as a safety professional, you have to understand how to effectively communicate and influence the management team so that you have an impact on the organization. So your organization will do something about risk. And that takes initiative and entrepreneurialism. Basically, the spirit there is you have to start with small experiments that allow yourself to fail. If it's not necessarily a problem if your safety mitigations are not effective, but make sure that you know if it's working on time, so you can change and adapt. So this is where I'd like to leave it. To come back to those 4 questions, make sure that everybody in your organization can answer this question the same way. What is most likely going to cause your next accident and incident? How do you know that? Make sure that you're not kidding yourself. What are you doing about it? And again, make sure you're not kidding about yourself. Is it working? I've put up a resource page with lots of links, SRMcoach.eu/Rio. Thank you very much for your attention. I'll be available for anybody who wants to discuss further.
Agradecemos as palavras do Sr. Jan Peeters e convidamos a todos para um breve intervalo de 20 minutos.